Hello, my friend. Welcome to your sleep story. My name is Stephen Dalton. I'm an Irish storyteller, and it's my great privilege to be the voice that you listen to as you go to sleep tonight. Tonight it's more incredibly dull history, although I might disagree with my own title on this one. For tonight, we visit my homeland of Ireland and look at its ancient history. You know, I used to be a tour guide at home, and I would bring people around Ireland, and I would often tell them the entire history of Ireland in 5 minutes. It was a fun little thing I did, but I chose not to do that tonight. And so I will go into lots of lovely detail. And let me know in the comments if you'd like to hear a part 2 about modern Ireland's history. Okay, let's do the relaxation session, which will take a few minutes before tonight's sleep story. I'm going to count down from 10 to 1, and as I do, allow yourself to let go more and more. 10. Feel the support of the bed beneath you, or the floor, or whatever surface you lie upon tonight. And beneath all of that, feel the support of the earth, our home. From the earth we receive a constant support. And as you become aware of that feeling of being supported, see if you can let go a little more now. Releasing tension, letting go. A little more now. 9. Feel into your body. Where are you still holding? Where do you feel tension? Maybe you feel pain. Maybe it's in your feet, in your lower legs. In your thighs, in your belly, in your chest, maybe you're like me, and you hold a lot of tension in your hands or in your face. See if you can let that tension go now. Just by becoming aware of it, we can ease the tension. 8. You are safe. Allow my voice to be an anchor of safety tonight, to be a friend. Know that my voice will only ever take you to safe places, and allow that fact, that feeling of trust, to enable you to let go a little more now. 7. The day is done. Whatever has been, has been. Whatever will be, will be. Whatever thoughts you might be having, know them for what they are, just thoughts. Don't judge them, positively or negatively. Know that they are not you. They are a symptom of being a human. And as they arrive, see them, but there's no need to follow them. Watch them go, floating away, like leaves on a moonlit river, or clouds passing through a starlit sky. 6. This is your moment. This is your time. You deserve rest. We all do. So as you move deeper and deeper towards deep rest tonight, know this: you deserve this rest as much as anyone else. 5. Peace lives within you. It is always there. It is a constant friend. A constant presence. It's just waiting to be found, waiting to be felt. See where you can find your peace tonight. 4. Perhaps allow a little gratitude now. Gratitude for the simple things, for this moment of peace, for the shelter you have tonight, for the breath in your body. 3. Begin to engage with your imagination now. Begin to see an island, a beautiful place covered in trees, with not one single human anywhere. An oasis of peace and green, far away from all that you know. 2. Checking in with your body one more time now. Your body has worked hard for you today. It's time to give it rest. And 1. Completely letting go now, as I tell you tonight's sleep story. Part 1, in which the island is not an island, and also not where you'd expect. Before Ireland was Ireland, it was somewhere else entirely. This may sound suspiciously poetic, but in this case, it is geologically, geographically, and staggeringly true. The land that would one day host more than its fair share of pubs, poets, and passive-aggressive weather was once part of a gigantic continental blob known, without much flair, as Gondwana, or possibly Laurasia, or sometimes both, depending on the year and the tectonic mood. This was a simple time, before borders, Brexit, or Bono. The planet's crust was in a state of lazy chaos, shuffling like a hungover postman with too many parcels and no clear address labels. The bit that would eventually become Ireland began its journey far closer to the South Pole than anyone Irish would be comfortable admitting. It was warmer there at the time, sort of, and mostly covered in sludgy oceans and volcanic burps. As the landmass drifted northward over the course of several 100 million years, a pace that would make even the most lethargic Dublin traffic jam seem lightning fast, it underwent a series of painfully slow makeovers. Sediments settled, rocks folded, volcanoes erupted at awkward times. No one was there to see it, which was probably for the best, because it was hideously dull to watch. Nevertheless, the land persisted, inching ever closer to its final coordinates, like a prehistoric pensioner on a long walk without a map. By the time we reach about 400 million years ago, give or take a disappointing eon, two hulking tectonic plates, Laurentia and Avalonia, decided to awkwardly bump into each other. The resulting geological kiss formed much of what we now call the island of Ireland, although it still had no sheep, no Guinness, and, tragically, no recorded mention in TripAdvisor. To summarize, in the beginning, Ireland wasn't Ireland. It was a soggy bit of rock, drifting slowly through prehistory, nowhere near where it should be, often lounging around near the equator, with absolutely nothing happening. And it stayed that way for a very, very long time. Part 2, in which things continue to be exceedingly rocky. If you were hoping for a dramatic turning point in the story of Ireland, I regret to inform you that we are still firmly in the domain of rocks. For millions upon millions of years, the land that would one day be called Era was mostly engaged in the thrilling task of assembling itself from geological leftovers. It was like a slow-motion jigsaw puzzle, except no one knew what the picture was meant to be, and all the pieces were made of sediment. Volcanoes made occasional appearances, coughing politely now and then, and depositing helpful layers of lava, which cooled into rock and did little else for several millennia. Mountains rose, only to get bored and sink again under their own weight. Great seas rolled in, and then quietly rolled back out, leaving behind crumpled fossils and sand that would eventually find its way into a child's shoe in Sligo, though not for a few 100 million years yet. Geologists, those quiet heroes of patient imagination, would one day name these formations with endearingly unmusical titles: the Dalradian supergroup, the Old Red Sandstone, the Leinster Granite. None of these rocks asked to be named, and most of them would have preferred to remain anonymous, as is the way with rocks. Somewhere in the middle of all this grinding and shifting, Ireland very slowly began to take shape. Not the final shape, of course. That would come later, with the help of ice and a great deal of erosion. But the idea of Ireland was beginning to form. Not the people, not the poetry, just the solid, muddy bones of the place, the foundations, a sort of prehistoric shrug of land, saying, well, I suppose I might as well be an island, eventually. It is worth noting, since I am Irish myself, that none of this felt particularly Irish at the time. There were no hedgerows, no stone walls, no arguments about tea, just rock, sea, and a sense of immense geological hesitation. Still, there is something oddly comforting about it. The island didn't rush. It didn't try to impress anyone. It simply became itself, one slow layer at a time. Part 3, in which ice makes itself perfectly known. After a leisurely few 100 million years of continental collisions, volcanic flutters, and sedimentary small talk, things began to get a bit nippy. Very slowly. So slowly, in fact, that if you blinked for a few millennia, you might not even miss it. Vast sheets of ice began making their way down from the north. These were not the polite, decorative kinds of ice you'd find in a summer drink, but the vast, continent-flattening kind that takes its time and leaves absolutely nothing where it found it. Ireland, still not quite the island we know today, was squashed repeatedly beneath these glacial intrusions. And while the ice never complained, it did have opinions. It scraped and scoured its way across the land like a bored toddler with a blunt crayon, carving out valleys, grinding down mountains, and deciding, somewhat arbitrarily, that Donegal should have high cliffs and Kerry should be majestic. It was during these repeated visits from the ice that the final shape of Ireland began to emerge. The island, as if finally accepting that it was no longer part of a larger landmass, shrugged into its current configuration. Locks were gouged into the earth like half-hearted thumbprints. Bogs began to gather in dips and hollows, quietly storing secrets for later centuries. And lonely glens, future haunts of poetry and sheep, were carved out with no thought at all for tourism brochures or Instagram angles. There were no humans to witness any of this, of course. Not a single person to shiver or slip or comment on the absurdity of the weather. The land, in its quiet and stubborn way, was simply becoming itself, slowly, patiently. Icy handprint after icy handprint. And though no Irish songs were yet sung, and no turf fires lit, the bones of the island were more or less in place. There was now, for the first time, something that could be reasonably pointed at and called Ireland, assuming, of course, that you had a map, a good coat, and a great deal of imagination. Part 4, in which the first people arrive and find a forest. By the time the first humans set foot on Ireland, somewhere around 10,000 years ago, the island had settled into something rather serene. The last of the ice had finally retreated, mumbling something inaudible about climate cycles, and what it left behind was something quietly magnificent. Ireland was, by all accounts, a forest. Not a forest dotted here and there between towns and roads and roundabouts, but a true, continuous wilderness. It stretched in every direction, dense, alive, and whispering. Oak and elm, ash and yew, hazel and birch, all growing thick and tall, rooted in rich glacial soil, and drinking deeply from the land's many rivers and springs. There were no fences, no borders, and no property deeds, only trees, so many trees, in fact, that old stories claim that if you were a little squirrel all that time ago in Ireland, you could travel from the top of the island to the bottom just via the trees without ever touching the ground. And while no squirrel ever wrote that down for certain, the idea captures something true. This was a land of canopy and shadow, of bird song and stillness, untouched by roads or ploughs, or the quiet arguments of neighbours over hedgerow placement. When the first people arrived, likely crossing by what would have been there then a land bridge, or by rudimentary boat from what is now Scotland, they would have encountered something that felt secret and sacred There were no buildings, no writing, and no names for anything yet. But there was beauty, raw, abundant, and almost overwhelming in its quietness. These early people came slowly. A few families, some tools, an instinct to keep moving, and to settle when the place felt right. They didn't change much at first. They fished, they hunted, they gathered what the forest gave, and in return, they listened. If they built anything, it was light, woven shelters beneath the trees, and hearths that smoked gently into the mossy air. The land didn't mind them being there. Not yet. Part 5, in which stones are stood up for reasons we can only guess at. As the centuries slipped by, the early people of Ireland began to settle more firmly into the land. The great forests still covered almost everything, but here and there, small clearings opened, places of light among the trees, where communities gathered, lived, and occasionally decided to stand up a very large stone for reasons they didn't feel the need to explain. We don't know exactly why they did this. We still don't. But stand them up they did. Tall ones, squat ones, and ones arranged in cautious circles that seem to hum with meaning even now. These were the earliest monuments, simple, deliberate, and deeply mysterious. They spoke not in words, but in weight, in shadow, in alignment with stars and seasons. Over time, these small communities grew more organized. They farmed, slowly clearing patches of woodland to grow barley and wheat. They domesticated animals and began shaping the land in small, careful ways. Rivers were used as paths, and pathways became tracks. Life moved gently, and the land remained deeply itself. Somewhere, imagine, It's around the 5th turning of the sun since the last great storm. A man with a quiet voice and calloused hands stands in a clearing near the bend of a river. He's not old, but his eyes are. Around him, others work slowly, lifting a flat slab of stone from the earth where it has slept for who knows how long. No one speaks much. They don't need to. They've all agreed that this stone will mark something important. A burial, perhaps, or a moment in time they didn't want to forget. A child watches from the shade, legs crossed, hair matted with moss and river air. She doesn't know why the adults are doing it, but she knows it matters. She watches the stone rise slowly, pulled by ropes of woven fiber and the strength of steady arms. When it finally stands, a hush settles over them, not out of reverence exactly, but something close to it. It's a shared silence, like holding your breath when the stars appear. There would be many stones after this one. Some would stand in groups, others alone. Some would align with the sun or the moon, or nothing at all. They were not monuments in the modern sense. They were acts of belonging, of presence, of saying, we were here, and we listened. The forests still held the island in their arms. Oaks and birches creaked in the wind. Ferns reached up from the damp earth, and foxes passed unseen. The people did not yet own the land, nor try to. They moved through it with care, clearing only what they needed, and always remembering what was there before. And still, they raised stones. Part 6, in which newcomers arrive with ideas, cattle, and a bit more noise. The quiet, forested Ireland of early people did not remain untouched forever. As with all things on this planet, change arrived, gradually, steadily, and then all at once. Around 4,000 years before the beginning of our modern calendar, new people began to appear along the edges of the island. They came not in armies or in great numbers, but in small groups with simple boats and with ideas of their own. These newcomers brought something unusual with them. Animals that followed obediently. Seeds they had saved from other lands. Knowledge passed down through memory instead of instinct. They did not move constantly through the forests as their ancestors had done, but instead cleared space, built sturdier homes, and stayed. It was the beginning of farming. The change wasn't immediate. It never is. For a time, the two ways of life, hunting and gathering, farming and settling, existed side by side. But over generations, the forests began to feel it. Trees were felled, not just for fire or shelter, but for fields. The land was coaxed into rows and cycles. The great wildness of Ireland began slowly to recede, not vanquished, not erased, but reshaped into something more manageable. The new people brought cattle. They brought sheep. They brought stone axes, pots made for storage, and simple, sensible tools. Their world was no longer just about surviving. It was about shaping. And they brought stories too. Though we'll never know exactly what they were, what we do know is that their presence marks a shift in the tone of the land. Where before there was stillness, now there was rhythm, harvests, seasons and cycles, the building of enclosed spaces, the keeping of animals, the steady thud of wooden posts into cleared ground. Imagine for a moment one of those early settlements, a group of dwellings in a clearing, not far from a river. where the water slows enough to bathe, to drink, to wash. The forest still stands at the edges, but it is held back now. Goats graze where ferns once grew. A fence, built of woven branches, creaks in the wind. Smoke rises from a small central hearth. A woman kneels at the edge of her plot, pressing something into the soil with patient fingers. Some early ancestor of barley, or perhaps flax for spinning. She glances up as a child runs past, chasing something unseen, laughing in a voice that echoes off the trees. Even now, the island is not crowded. There are no cities, no kings, no politics, yet only people living close to the land, sometimes together, sometimes apart. The forests are still deep and dark in many places. In the far west, they stretch for miles without interruption. But the change has begun, and it will not be undone. Ireland is still beautiful, still a great, green, quiet, but it is no longer untouched. Part 7, in which metal is discovered, and everything becomes slightly more complicated. It is tempting to imagine that things might have stayed simple forever, that people would have continued quietly, tending their small patches of land, living at the pace of seasons, never wanting more than what the forest or the earth could offer. But that is not how humans tend to be. Not even the early Irish ones. Somewhere, sometime, around 2500 BC, someone in Ireland, perhaps in the east, near the low hills of what is now Wicklow, noticed that certain stones, when heated just right, turned into something else, something harder, something brighter, something useful. That something was copper, and with it came a slow but steady unraveling of the age of stone. It didn't happen overnight. It never does. But once metal appeared, things began to shift. copper tools replaced flint ones. Decorative objects were shaped, beads, blades, little trinkets of status or meaning. Not long after, copper met tin, and from that meeting came bronze. Bronze was stronger, more durable, and more versatile, and so began what we now call the Bronze Age. The people who worked metal were not ordinary folk. They held a kind of quiet power. To coax metal from rock was not simply a technical skill. It was mysterious, transformative. It gave them a certain authority in the community, and with that came the earliest traces of hierarchy. Not kings yet, but the beginnings of status. Settlements grew slightly larger. Trade began, not just between local groups, but across the sea. There is evidence of contact with Britain, and even with parts of mainland Europe. The island that had once been a remote, forested hush was now beginning to murmur. People moved more. Goods traveled. Ideas slipped from one region to another, tucked inside stories or carved into simple tools. And along with this new material came something even older. The instinct to bury the dead with care. Not just wrapped in furs beneath the trees, but within tombs of stone, passage graves, ring barrows, wedge tombs, each a silent act of remembering. Many of these survive to this day, moss-covered and half-forgotten in fields and forests. Others more well-known and visited by many. Imagine now a bronze worker at the edge of a lake. He is squatting beside a shallow pit. The fire inside it, glowing low and steady. The air is thick with smoke, and the sour tang of burning peat. In his hand is a small crucible, cradled like something sacred. He tilts it slowly, and the molten metal slides into a carved stone mold. Just a simple blade, nothing fancy. But in this moment, something new is born. a sharp edge, a different future. And so, Ireland, still green and forested, still quiet in many places, began its slow turn toward complexity. Fields were cleared more quickly. Tools were more efficient. Some people had more than others. The forest still stood, but it no longer felt eternal. Not quite. Part 8, in which power gathers and the island begins to tell stories about itself. By the time the Bronze Age had fully settled across the island, Ireland had changed. It still held its forests, its rivers, and its rain. Those would never leave entirely. But the feeling of the place had shifted. There were now places that belonged to some and not to others. Land was spoken for. Paths were worn through hills. The quiet hum of territory, trade, and inheritance had begun. With these changes came stories. They didn't arrive fully formed, of course. They weren't written down yet. No one in Ireland had learned to do that. But they were carried in the air, in the hush around a fire, in the slow telling of what had happened long ago, or what might have. Some stories were told about the land itself, others about the people who lived on it, and some, perhaps the most powerful, were about things no one had seen, but everyone believed. They spoke of gods and warriors, of women with powers, and men who could not be defeated. They told of great cattle raids and tragic lovers, of magical weapons and kings who could command the weather. Some stories grew so large they became part of the land, tied to a hill or a river bend or a shadow in a valley that always seemed to move a little when no one was watching. One of the oldest stories told in those days was about a people called the Tuatha De Danann, or the tribe of the goddess Danu. They were said to have arrived in Ireland from the sky, or from a far-off place, bringing with them 4 great treasures: a sword, a stone, a spear, and a cauldron that never emptied. They were wise, beautiful, and powerful, and they lived in harmony with the land. But they were not alone. Another group, the Fear Bolg, were already here, and later the Miletians would come, those said to be the ancestors of the Gales. Battles were fought, victories claimed, but none of this happened in the way history would later demand. These were not dates and documents. These were stories with roots in the soil and branches in the stars. They explained not just what had happened, but why things were the way they were, and people listened. Imagine one such story being told on a night in early autumn. A family sits beneath a curved hazel tree. The sky is clear. The stars are sharp. A fire crackles low in a stone ring. An older woman speaks, not loudly, not theatrically, but with the quiet rhythm of someone who has told the tale 100 times. Her words are slow, measured, familiar. The children lean forward. Even the dogs stay still. She tells them of Lu of the Long Arm, the warrior of many skills, and of Balor, whose terrible eye could kill with a glance, of a battle fought not for gold or land, but for the right to belong. These stories didn't need to be believed exactly. They needed to be carried, and they were. And so the land of Ireland became a patchwork of tales. Every valley had its legend. Every hill had once been a throne. Stones were no longer just stones. They were footprints, weapons, curses, or resting places of heroes who had turned to light. Ireland was still a quiet place, still small in the great sprawl of the world, but within its fields and forests, a voice was growing, a memory, a sense of itself, not as something fixed, but as something told. Part 9, in which iron sharpens, and the first names begin to echo. By the time iron found its way into the hands of the people, Ireland had already begun to murmur with stories, pathways, customs, and names. The Bronze Age had lingered for a long while, long enough to shape the hills and the hearts of those who lived there. But eventually, even bronze gave way. Iron was harder, more durable. It kept its edge longer, and that edge was used not only for tools and farming, but quietly, and more often than people like to admit, for power. The people who knew how to work iron did not just shape metal. They shaped communities. With iron, one could clear land faster, defend it more effectively, and hold it more securely. It was around this time, roughly 500 BC, though the years are always soft at the edges, that Ireland began to take on a form we might vaguely recognize. Tribes gathered around leaders. Some were wise, some were strong. A few were both. Boundaries began to take hold, not drawn with lines, but with memory, river, tree, and hill. The land was spoken for now, claimed in stories, guarded in battle, and honored in tradition. With the Iron Age came the Celts, or so we say. In truth, Celt is a word placed on Ireland later, from outside, but the language, the customs, and the styles of art began to resemble those found elsewhere in the wide, drifting net of Celtic culture. Spirals moved into jewelry. Horns and brooches took on new shape. People buried their dead with iron and meaning, and names began to echo. For the first time, certain places were known by the same name for long enough that they started to stick. Tara, Owen Mucka, Cruachan, These weren't towns in the modern sense, but centers, places where the world bent slightly, where people gathered, where stories rooted deeper than usual. Tara especially stood apart, a hill not much higher than the rest, but older in the imagination. It was said to be the seat of kings, the High Kings, though whether they ruled the whole island is unclear. What's certain is that they ruled something, the memory of a place, the idea of unity, the whisper of central power. Still, Ireland did not become a single thing. It remained, as it would for much of its history, a patchwork, a gathering of places with their own rules, their own chiefs, their own hills to defend, and rivers to cross. There was no Ireland as a whole, only the idea of it, scattered in names, held together by stories, and passed from voice to voice around smoky fires. Imagine now a smith at work beneath a thatched shelter, the air thick with heat and soot. His apprentice stands nearby, watching as he hammers a blade into shape. Not a sword, just a blade for cutting roots or trimming rushes. But the iron is stubborn. It must be persuaded. Everything must be done with patience. The smith's name is known in the region, and perhaps one day it will be carved into something. But for now, it is simply spoken, passed on by those who trust his hands. This was how Ireland remembered, not in books, not yet, but in repetition, in rhythm, in names that stuck and names that didn't. The forests were thinner now. Fields were larger. The paths between places were more certain. And while the stories grew longer, the silences between them did too. Part 10. in which writing arrives, and the land begins to remember in stone. The next great change came quietly. It did not arrive with warriors or with conquest, but with marks, lines, notches, and grooves cut into stone. This was Ogham, Ireland's first written script. No parchment, no ink, just letters carved into the edge of a standing stone, read from bottom to top like a ladder of meaning. The Ogham stones began appearing around the 4th century AD, give or take a few hesitant generations. They did not tell long stories or describe great events. They did something simpler and more lasting. They remembered names of so-and-so, son of so-and-so, they said. No dates, no poetry, just a record chiseled into the edge of time. Most of these stones still stand today, some tilted, some nearly lost in hedgerows, others upright in fields where no one reads them anymore. But they were the first sign that Ireland was beginning to speak to the future. At around the same time, or shortly after, something even larger arrived: Christianity. It didn't come by force. There was no army, just a few determined figures. Most famously, a man named Patrick, who travelled across the island, speaking of a new faith. What he found was a people already rich in tradition, already deeply spiritual in their own way. So he did something rare in the history of religions. He adapted. The new beliefs did not erase the old ones overnight. They folded in gently. Wells that had once been sacred to nature spirits were rededicated to saints. Holy hills remained holy. Old festivals took on new meanings, but kept their shape. The two worlds overlapped, not peacefully exactly, but not in open conflict either. What came of this slow blending was something uniquely Irish. The rise of the monasteries. Within a few generations, monks had begun to build small communities of stone and quiet devotion. They prayed, they farmed, and most importantly, they wrote. They copied manuscripts, not just of the new religion, but of the stories already being told across the land. The tales of warriors and gods, of queens and curses, were given new shape, written in ink on vellum and preserved with care. And it's worth pausing here, just for a moment, to think about what this meant. For the first time in Irish history, the stories that had travelled by voice, generation to generation, were now being written down, and not just remembered, but shaped. Some were changed, some were preserved as they were, but now there was a record, a memory that wouldn't vanish when the storyteller died. It's hard to say exactly where it all began. Clonmacnoise, Glendalough, Armagh. Each place tells its own story. What matters is that these places became centers, not just of religion, but of thought. The monks didn't just copy texts, they created art, illuminated letters with gold and blue and red, intricate swirls wrapped around prayers and poetry alike. And so, without war or empire, Ireland entered a new age, an age of scribes and scholars, of ink and silence, of stone huts and candlelight. The land had begun to remember itself, not in myth, but in script. Part 11, in which the quiet becomes beautiful. By the early centuries after the birth of Christ, Ireland had taken on a shape both literal and imagined. The land was long since formed. The stories had settled in their places, and the people, scattered, tribal, proud, had begun to see the world not only as something to survive in, but as something to tend, to observe, and to preserve. And so came the scribes. Christianity, which, as we said earlier, had entered the island not with swords, but with sandals and scripture, brought something that would transform Ireland, not by conquering it, but by writing it down. Nowhere is that legacy more visible than in the Book of Kells. It is hard to say when it was begun exactly, perhaps around the year 800, possibly earlier, and no one knows precisely where. Iona, some say. Kells itself, others argue. But the place is less important than the work, because the work is astonishing. The Book of Kells is a gospel manuscript, yes, but to call it that is a bit like calling the sea wet. It is not simply a book. It is a staggering act of attention, a quiet cathedral of ink and color, created by hands that we will never know. In silence, we will never hear. The letters are formed with a patience that defies explanation. Decorations unfurl like vines, spirals within spirals, creatures hidden within knots, lines so fine they seem painted with a single breath. There are full-page illustrations, but also marginal doodles, tiny human faces grinning from corners. Gold gleams without shouting. Blue hums with a stillness that feels like prayer. To look at it now, even centuries later, is to feel something deeper than admiration. It is to be reminded that beauty does not have to be loud. Let us imagine, then, one of the monks behind this great labor. it is night. A cell of stone. The walls are rough but dry. A small fire burns low in a corner hearth, casting no heat, only a wavering light. Outside, the wind is trying to be heard, but the walls ignore it. Inside, at a narrow desk, sits a man with stooped shoulders and ink-stained fingers. His robe is worn but clean. He has not spoken in hours. Before him lies a sheet of vellum, smooth and pale. The lamp beside him is trimmed. His ink, oak gall, dark as thought, waits in a small pot. He dips the quill and begins again. The page he works on has no words yet, only the beginnings of a letter, a large one, an initial. It will take a week to complete, perhaps longer. Around it, he begins to add color. Tiny dots. A curl. The foot of a bird. None of it is rushed. Every movement is part of the prayer. He does not think of fame. He does not know this page will survive him by more than 1,000 years. He only thinks of balance, of silence, of line and light and meaning. From time to time he stops, not to rest, but to listen. For what? He isn't sure. But he always hears it. That stillness, that sense of being a small part of something long and slow and deeply worth the doing. He draws again. And so, through nights like this, the Book of Kells came into being. not in a blaze of history, but in the almost imperceptible act of care. Part 12, in which we remember what was once forgotten. And so, the ancient part of Ireland's history draws to a close, not with an ending, but with a soft turning outward. By the early medieval centuries, the world outside the island had begun to shift. Empires rose and fell. Armies moved. Old gods faded. New orders took root. And Ireland, stubborn and self-contained, stood like a kind of memory at the edge of it all. Its forests were quieter. Its people, still many, still divided, but slowly inching toward something different. The old oral stories had been written down. The myths now lived in ink as well as in memory. The hills still whispered the names of gods and warriors, but they were quieter now, listening, perhaps, to the sound of bells from monastic towers and the turning of book pages in tiny scriptoria. This was no longer ancient Ireland. It was something else now, something preparing, perhaps, to face the long and complicated road ahead. A road of visitors, invaders, saints, scribes, chieftains, poets, and eventually politics. But all of that would come later, and not here, not in this story. Here we end not with noise, but with the long silence of memory. Ireland, in its ancient days, was a place of shape and patience, a place where stones were lifted without haste, where names were remembered in carved lines, where stories moved like rivers, slow, winding, necessary. And if you were to walk the land of Ireland now, in search of those days, you wouldn't find them easily. but you might feel them beside a moss-covered standing stone, or in the broken edge of a carved ring fort, or in the brief hush of a wooded path, where something once mattered and still does somehow. Ancient Ireland is not gone. It has simply gone quiet.